Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us for the Climate Adaptation Research for BC Agriculture Workshop. This session is about innovation for adaptation in small berry production. My name is Serena Black, and I am the Agriculture Extension Specialist from the University of Northern BC, and I'm also the current chair of the BC Agriculture Climate Adaptation Research Network. As we begin, I would like to acknowledge that I am hosting this session today from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Lheidli T'enneh. We have people joining us today from across the province in many different places, potentially outside of BC as well. So I'd like to acknowledge the traditional caretakers of those lands. This session is part of the annual workshop hosted by the BC Agricultural Climate Adaptation Research Network, ACARN for short. ACARN is a provincial network launched in 2017 to improve the linkages and collaboration to more effectively address climate adaptation research and the extension needs in the BC agriculture sector. This workshop is a chance to share knowledge on research and tools available to support agriculture climate change adaptation. It is also an opportunity for questions, discussions, and networking. Our session here today includes two presenters, and we will have a Q&A break after each presenter. Before we get going, I'm going to go over a couple of the quick Zoom housekeeping notes. To ask your questions today, we are going to ask you to use the Q&A box instead of the chat. So you'll find the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom control panel, and you can enter your questions throughout the session as you think of them. It's easier for us to keep track if we're using that box rather than the chat box. And you'll note once you start seeing other people's questions come up in the Q&A, you can actually have the opportunity to upvote a question that somebody else has made by clicking the thumbs up symbol. So again, feel free to use the chat box with the other attendees, introduce yourself, add comments there, but please direct your questions over to the Q&A. Lastly, I would like to acknowledge that many of us are now working from home under new work from home conditions. So please bear with us and our speakers if there's any unexpected distractions or interruptions that happen throughout our session today. Before we get started, I do want to help our presenters to get an understanding of who we have joining us live here this morning. We do have more than 60 people joining in. So we're going to launch a poll really quick that will help us get to know our audience a little bit better and help our presenters make sure that they're going to be answering your questions. So we should be able to launch a poll. So if you could take a few moments just to go through there. Now with the results. All right, so we have a good variety of people joining us. It looks like we have 46% coming from government. We have some research scientists and a fair amount of industry associations and producers as well. And it's great to see some students joining in for our session today. So that's great. Thank you, everybody. Happy to have you here. So I'm going to get started and introduce our first speaker. So it is my pleasure to begin the session with Grant McMillan. Grant is the manager for the BC region for International Crop Management Services Contract Research Team. His agriculture experience spans from Atlantic Canada west to Alberta and BC, and he has been working with a wide range of cropping systems, including small fruit. So today, Grant is going to be sharing his research on reflective tarps to manage extreme heat in blueberry production. Welcome, Grant.
Thanks, Serena. I'll just pull up the slide here and everyone can see. So this is a project that ICMS worked on this year, looking at using reflective tarps to help with post-harvest berry quality for the blueberry growers. So survival of the fittest. When we hear this, survival of the fittest is a term used by Darwin to describe the species' ability to evolve. Many of us, when we see this, we think that it just means that the species that's physically fit is the one that survives. But really what it means is it talks about the species' ability that adapts the best to the environment is the one that survives. Adapting is the key to survival. Within the BC blueberry industry, it's facing lots of different pressures in the marketplace. We're operating on a global market. The industry is maturing. We're seeing increasing production costs, shrinking margins, and of course, climate change. When we think climate change, many of us think that it's just a recent phenomenon, but really climate change has been happening all the time. 10,000 years ago, North America was under a sheet of ice. And when we think global warming, many of us think that, hey, it's just going to get hotter and stay hot. But really what we're experiencing is an increased occurrence of extreme weather events. Farmers are experiencing higher rainfalls in the spring, so they need to tile their fields to take the water off. A few months later, we're seeing hotter, drier conditions, and so we need to use irrigation to put the water back on. So what is climate change affecting? How's climate change affecting the berry industry? Well, during the post-harvest phase of picking, it's affecting the extreme heat is affecting the berry quality that the growers are taking off their fields. The berries, when they're picked, they're exposed to sun. When they're sitting in the fields waiting to go to the packer, they're exposed to sun and heat. During transport, they're exposed to sun and heat. And whenever they get to the packer, they're, if they're not immediately put through the line, they're also exposed to sun and heat. So it was identified by the berry growers and the BC Climate Action Change Initiative that this is a gap. So, the farmers need some help in this area. How do you protect your fruit after you pick it and ensure that you have that good quality going to the marketplace? Packers estimate on a hot day, growers are losing 3 to 5% of their fruit because of heat exposure. That's a fairly significant number when you're talking thousands of pounds. So to adapt, to help the industry adapt, we need to look at what others are doing, what other industries are doing to protect their fruit. We don't have to look too much further than the BC cherry growers. They have been using reflective tarps for 20 some years. Here's a great example of them using it in the fields. They're placing these reflective tarps over the fruit as it's being picked. It's providing great protection against the sun. And, the industry has really benefited from this. It's increased their fruit quality and allowed them to kind of break into new markets. 20 years ago, Ag Canada did some research in blueberries with these tarps, and they determined that, yeah, they work great. On the top graph here, you see that the berries underneath the tarp, the temperature is nice and plateau and low compared to the ambient and open temperature. They also found out that the humidity stays nice and high under the tarps as well. So, there's a double benefit to that, to the tarps use. So this project was geared around extension, demonstrating the use of the tarps to the growers and the packers. So we partnered up with a number of different packers in the industry, and plus their growers that they work with, and as well as a number of other growers that ICMS has worked with in the past. We tried to identify a wide range of size of packers and growers just to get a good cross section of the industry. Here we see the tarps in action in a blueberry farm in Abbotsford. This is a great example of what many growers are doing. They're picking, the fruit is being hand picked and being taken to a collection area. And um, without those tarps, the berries would be kind of sitting there in the sun, even though there's an awning in the field, as you can see from the shadows and non-shadows on that tarp. Those berries would still be exposed to quite a bit of sun and heat. Now, this grower did run into some labor issues this year because of COVID, and he mentioned to me that he was kind of delayed getting his produce to the packers. And he said that because of these tarps, he felt that the tarps helped save his crop. It kept the quality uh, in the berries. So he saw a big benefit from the tarps right away. Here's another example of the tarps in action in Abbotsford. So the first time this grower used the tarps was on a 30 to 35 degree day, and he just couldn't believe how well they worked. Here's an example, in this photo, the tarps covering 2 pallets of hand lugs, and he said that, the berries that weren't covered were just baking in the sun, and the berries underneath this tarp were just cool like they were in the fridge. So um, that's a great testament to how well these tarps do work, and how practical they are. So one way that just to explain how they do work is the white reflective material on the outside helps bounce the sun off to prevent any heat buildup. And as you can see in the bottom of on the bottom of the photo, the under layer of the tarp has a reflective material, mylar material that helps distribute any heat that is in the stack. So um, so that's how they work. If you have any questions, if you were thinking how they do work. Now, as you can kind of see in this photo, like the tarp is kind of big and bulky, and that can be a downside if it's a windy day. It is kind of somewhat difficult to work with sometimes. So one way we kind of one solution we came up with to fix that is come up with a slip-on cover. And here you can kind of see 2 examples of how berries are packed in the field. So another issue that we identified was, how do you protect these berries as they're being set up in the field to get moved to the processor. So here's an example of the slip-on cover that we developed with the manufacturer. So it's a five-sided box cover that just slips right over these stacks, and they're fairly easy with one person, better with 2 to put them on. And here's an example of it's in use at Blueberry Junction. Here you see Kerry Seal kind of strapping it down on the pallet on the back of the truck. And as you can see, like, everything's nice and tight around that pallet, and there's nothing flapping in the wind. And at the same time, your berries are being protected. And if you have a truckload of these covered, your truckload is covered with these covers. If you're sitting in the processing line for 5 or 6 hours, that your berries are being protected, and you're saving your investment. Another cover that we developed was just a small basic slip-on cover to go onto the flats. And these are very economical. They're wholesale price around $2 a piece. And the intent with these is, as your pickers are picking the fruit in the field, you can just, once the flat is filled, you can slip these over, and your fruit's going to be protected right off the bat. So great way to, great practical way to help save your fruit. We did take some data, some temperature data of the berries under the tarp and not under the tarp. And here's an example on a hot day on the 31st. The bottom line you can see is the temperature underneath the tarp, and it's a nice flat line, no dramatic spikes. Whereas the berries that weren't covered, you see that nice gradual peak to the midday, and where the temperatures are reaching high 20s. So big dramatic difference between covered and not covered. We also looked at the berry weight loss under the tarps and not under the tarps. So covering your fruit with these tarps, reduce loss by about 4% by weight. So when you're looking at the thousands of pounds of berries coming off your field at a time, 4% adds up to be a pretty significant savings. So going forward, things that we need to be looking at as an industry, as a whole, and individually going forward, and how do we adapt, right? So, because the marketplace, the industry is maturing, quality is going to become a bigger, more important factor. And you're kind of starting to see that right now in the industry. Like packers are going to be wanting to partner up with growers that are able to kind of bring great quality fruit to their plant. And one example of that is Berry Haven Farms. Talking to David Mutz, he said he likes to partner up with small growers because he knows the quality is there. So so as a small grower, you're thinking, how do I compete with the bigger guys? Well, that's one way you can compete, is the quality. And if you're bringing 2 pallets in at a time on the back of your truck, an investment of $70 for a slip-on cover, that's $150. That's the price of a tank of gas. That's a very, very small investment to ensure that you're going to have great quality fruit coming to your packer, right? And we need to be looking at a partnership. How do the packers and growers partner together to move the industry forward? And these tarps are a great way to do that, to ensure great quality coming off the fields. So I just want to acknowledge that the funding was provided by the Climate Action Initiative and facilitated by the BC blueberry growers, and just wanted to give thanks to all the growers that helped out in this project and the packers. So we'll just open it up to questions right now.
Fantastic. Thank you, Grant. From the questions coming in, I think you've done an excellent job at a very applied project, because you can tell by the type of questions that we have. So let's just jump right in. We have a question from Blair, in that the tarps that you're showing, you have the silver side down with the white on top. So what are the mechanisms happening there? Why do you do it that way instead of the reverse?
That's a great question. When we first started working with these tarps and we made the slip-on covers, I thought, yeah, silver goes on the outside because it's most reflective. And I was talking to Peter Todovan there, and he said, nope, you got it inside out. And he explained that the white is more reflective than the silver. So that's to reflect the sun that's coming in contact to the berries. And then the silver mylar on the inside helps distribute any heat that's built up in the stack. And, so any heat that might be in the berries already, it helps pull that out and distribute it. And it's also an interesting concept too. One other fact is we were looking at, okay, do we need to put any vent holes in these covers? And Peter explained that no, we don't need to do that because the way that mylar works is it pulls that heat and distributes it.
Okay, so that makes a lot more sense. Just because it seems more shiny to our eye doesn't mean it's actually more reflective of the sun itself. Okay, fantastic. And this is great. People are seeing the thumbs up and voting up questions. So let's go by popular demand. On the boxes where you're showing that it's just the top cover only, the one that you said was quite economical.
Yeah.
How does the temperature and the humidity protection compare in that top box with the cover compared to the ones going down below to the bottom box?
Yeah, so we didn't test any temperature, didn't put any hobos and test any temperature in those small trays, but it would be fairly comparable. Now, the trays are fairly short, so there's not going to be much radiant energy hitting the side of those trays. And the key thing is, when that tray's maybe sitting on the ground, because it's so short, all the sunlight's going to be hitting the top of that cover and reflecting off. So.
Right. Okay. Good to know. And we had a couple questions along the same line of longevity. So how durable are these covers? Can you store them and have them used for multiple seasons?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So whenever the tarps first kind of got introduced into the industry about 15, 20 years ago, there was a number of growers and some packers that, adapted to that change right away. Great example, Jason Smith, he's used these tarps for a long time, and he says, you can get about 5 years out of them. But you have to kind of take care of them and, make sure that they're washed properly and all that. So, yeah.
Good care is always important. Okay, so the next, we got some voted up questions here. Do you believe that this technology could be transferred to the horticulture industry to help keep vegetables cool after harvest?
That's a great question. One thing that was identified, just talking to the different packers, in particular David Mutz, he made a great comment that this technology could be transferred to other industries, and in particular, he made comment about the raspberry industry. So, fresh picking raspberries, like this would be ideal for that industry to protect that fruit. And then, like going into root crops or other veggies, definitely. And one of the growers that we work with, Ridgedale Organics, I gave them a small tarp, and they do a lot of direct sales to farmers markets. So they actually use the tarps covering their produce at the market, in the marketplace, and they say, yep, day one, immediate positive effect.
Oh wow, yeah. So as a market gardener myself, I had already started thinking about how I could use this on some of the crops that we have. And you did mention farm partners. So what was the total number of farm partners you had for this project?
If you took into the growers that were associated with the packers, we're up about 20 to 30 different growers.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and the packers, I gave the tarps to the packers, and they kind of distributed to their growers, and they did a lot of internal testing and product concept proving. Good example, Silver Valley, like I gave them 10 slip-on covers, and they use those extensively with their growers, and they got a lot of use out of them, they said.
And so the results that you shared with us today, was that from one farm, or were there kind of combined multiple farms there?
That was kind of multiple farms that we worked with directly, and all the data is data that I collected on our own farm.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Perfect. I think we have time potentially to get to all the questions that are currently here, if I'm remembering my cues properly. If not, I'm sure Shauna will get me in check. But so the next question we have is, could these tarps be used for capturing heat or holding heat in a cold weather event? This is a question actually back from the Maritimes. Like several years ago, Nova Scotia had a big blueberry loss because of a late frost. So any thoughts on that component of the tarps?
Yeah, I would think that they wouldn't do well in that regard, because they're kind of designed to kind of disperse heat. Like there's no thermal blanket action with them. Especially when that mylar's made to distribute that heat, right? So okay. I think if you're looking for the capture heat, you should be looking at more of a thermal blanket setup. And what's interesting from this project, because we did an article in the Country Life in BC, is Owens Corning has kind of got onto this, and they're looking at maybe taking some of their insulation packaging material, and kind of developing for the blueberry industry. So that's something that I can pass on to them if there's interest in a thermal blanket setup. So
Oh, interesting. Yeah, it seems very applied, and it's great that you have those partnerships that you're getting the direct feedback and moving forward.
yeah, one thing too that I didn't mention in the because there's so much information coming from this project. One thing I forgot to mention was the growers were also excited with the tarps or the slip-on covers ability to protect the fruit during rain events. So we had quite a bit of rain during the harvest season, and they were just excited about the tarp's ability to protect the fruit during heavy rain as they were about protecting the fruit during high heat.
Oh, okay. So it does a couple of dual purposes
Yeah.
there.
So, that you got to keep that in mind whenever you're looking at the capital investment of making that purchase, right? So,
Absolutely. And
yeah.
are these tarps available, like widely available across Canada? Is it only one manufacturer that's making them? How would
Yeah,
people
so
find more information?
that's a great question. There are different makers, but in BC, the main distributor is Bush Pro out of Vernon. And originally, these tarps were designed and used in the forest industry to protect the seedlings whenever they're doing replant, and then they started getting used in the egg industry through the cherry growers.
Mm, it's good to see that crossover.
Yeah, but yeah, like the slip-on covers, everything that we kind of developed with the project, Bush Pro is working on providing those off the shelf. So, if growers are wanting to make those purchases over the winter in the next year, like they're going to be readily available.
Mhm. So we do have a couple more questions coming in, but I think we probably have time for one more. So I'll ask the one with the most votes. But as we've mentioned, perhaps Grant, you'll be able to answer the other two questions that are sitting there in the chat box as we get started into Eric's presentation.
Okay.
So for the last question, live question, it says, do the growers get their same tarps back when they've sent their crop into the processors, and who's responsible for their care when the growers take them to the packers?
That's a great question. Going forward, different ways I can kind of see these tarps being used is they could be possibly driven by the packers. So maybe the packers are supplying the tarps to their growers, so that when the grower comes and picks up their flats and their pallet and makes a deposit on those, they also get the tarps or the covers, and so they comes to the field, the berries are picked, everything's covered, everything goes back to the packer, and you get your deposit back, right? That's one way I kind of see that the industry kind of moving and adapting this technology. The other way is the growers just using their tarps, buying the tarps themselves and taking that initiative. Um, when you get to the packer, there is some time involved to kind of pull the cover off and tie it up, pack it nicely, but it's very small, in the grand scheme of things, that's a very small time for the benefit, right? So
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm taking a look. It looks like, is Eric still on with us, or did we lose him temporarily?
Looks like we've lost him he's here. Okay.
Perfect. So we will thank you so much, Grant, for all. There was a couple more questions there, so I've noted them down, and perhaps we can get into those in the chat. But thank you so much for sharing such an applied project that's helping growers, and a great start to our workshop here.
Awesome. So, thanks a lot. Thanks for having me.
All right, so let's move on to our second presentation, since we haven't lost him. So I'm excited to introduce Eric Gerbrandt from Sky Blue Horticulture. Eric has 13 years of experience in the BC berry industry, including research on applied horticultural management of blueberries, raspberries, and strawberries. He serves as the research director for the BC Blueberry and Raspberry Councils and the Strawberry Growers Association, as well as holding an adjunct position with the Faculty of Land and Food Systems at the University of British Columbia. Today, he is going to be presenting on a crop that was the focus of his PhD research in plant sciences at the University of Saskatchewan, Haskaps, from the angle of berry crop diversification as a method to sidestep climate change impacts. So welcome to Eric.
All right, can you see me? You see my screen there?
Right now I'm seeing a blue screen, a blue Windows screen.
A blue screen.
The presentation used to be there. Okay, now we see the presenter view of the...
I swear I do know how to do this. I just got kicked off the meeting and it messed me all up. Sorry about that.
Oh, that happened to me 2 weeks ago. You wouldn't, yeah, it took me a while to recover. So take your time, Eric. We're doing really well with time right now. Sometime when that was happening to me, Eric, I was able to actually switch it in my Zoom settings. That makes a difference.
There we go. How's that?
Oh,
I gotcha.
Perfect. That's looking great.
All right, sorry for that. I froze there just 2 minutes before my presentation started. Thanks for the introduction there, and it's a pleasure to talk about Haskap today. I looked through the audience list there, and there's a lot of names that I recognize and some that I don't. So talking about Haskap is kind of like sharing about your 17th century collection of Egyptian spoons. Often people don't know anything about what you're talking about, and you have to try and get their interest. And so that's what I'm hoping to be able to do today, to talk about Haskap, which is a novel oblong little blue fruit, as a opportunity for berry growers as a way to sidestep the impacts of climate change as opposed to try and combat them. So just an overview of what I'd like to cover today. First, I'd like to talk about how Haskap is an opportunity to sidestep climate change impacts, and in particular, talk about the extreme heat that is projected to occur during midsummer months. And I'd like to talk a little bit about Haskap genetics and give an overview of common names, because I know that most people will not be familiar with these 17th century Egyptian spoons. And then discuss the climatic adaptation of the crop, and specifically its phenology. And phenology is the progression of developmental events that the crop goes through throughout the season, like bud break and bloom and such. And then I'll touch a little bit on fruit morphology and biochemistry before providing some indications of where this crop needs to go in order to be a legitimate alternative crop for berry growers. So just a couple of theoretical points here. First is that the concept of phenotypic plasticity, which is the way in which a crop can manifest a different phenotype or physical manifestation of all its genetic traits in different environments. And so in the case of grape, you've got Pinot Grigio, you could grow that in Italy, or you could grow that in the Okanagan. And there's going to be an interaction between the genes and the environment to result in the phenotype. And depending on the crop and the cultivar in specific, the degree to which it will be plastic and show a different phenotype in those environments varies. And that is that's important for understanding adaptation of a crop to a new region. And then the second concept is regarding stress. From a physiological standpoint, a plant has two choices. It can either develop tolerance, and we can develop tolerance in plants through plant breeding, or we can just avoid the stress completely. So I did several years of research across the Fraser Valley, looking at adaptation of a whole slew of different Haskap genetics to this area to see whether or not we could take it from a relatively undeveloped crop and find a way to develop it as a mainstream agronomic crop for a main fruit production region like the Fraser Valley. And with Haskap, and in regard to climate change, if we're going to get hotter summers, then let's just beat the heat by getting out of the kitchen. It's a very early season crop that is harvested before it ever gets super hot in the Fraser Valley for more than a day or two. And that's towards the end of May and into the beginning of June. And so in order to develop blue honeysuckle as an alternative crop, there's three objectives that need to be pursued through plant breeding and horticultural management research. First is to obtain a broader adaptation to temperate climates, and then also to improve morphological characteristics relating to the agronomic potential of the crop and enhancing fruit quality and nutritional content, because you could have a crop that grows well from a phenological standpoint, but if it doesn't harvest well and if it doesn't taste good, then there's not much point in growing it. And my main, this is my thesis statement from my PhD thesis. Haskap, or blue honeysuckle germplasm, does in fact contain the variability and complexity in the phenological traits, the agronomic morphological traits, and the fruit quality traits that will make it possible to develop this as a commercial crop for temperate climates. And some of the important points on this is that, as I mentioned, it's a very early season crop that comes in before strawberries. It's got very high antioxidant content, though the content is nowhere near as high as some of the popular claims are out there. It's got a unique flavor profile, and it's relatively acidic. So it's got it's not just a bland sugary fruit. It's more of a balanced fruit with sugar and acid. It can be used as a fresh product, or it could be sold as an individual quick freeze or IQF frozen product, or used in any number of processed products. It's relatively cold hardy, and this is what we're going to talk about in a second regarding its phenology, as it's adapted to cold regions such as Russia and northern Japan. And so far in most of the production regions in Canada, it has relatively few serious pest or disease issues. However, it's got some significant barriers to large scale production, particularly in regard to its fruit quality and its harvestability, which brings up the point that there are a lot of knowledge gaps regarding cultivars, how to grow them. And as a result, in the marketplace, there's not much recognition of the crop. And so the crop essentially is lacking market development at this point. Just to put some pros and cons side by side, it doesn't have a lot of horticultural requirements, quite an easy plant to grow. On the other side, it's a relatively small fruit, and yields are nowhere near as high as some crops that it would compete against, such as a blueberry. It's got a unique flavor, but when it comes to the market, that's not necessarily a good thing because it doesn't have recognition in the marketplace yet. You can harvest all the berries at once, which is great, but sometimes harvest quality is quite low because of the crop's anatomy. And then it's very hardy to extreme winter cold, so you can grow it in Saskatchewan, where nothing likes living. I had to go live out there when I went to graduate school, so I can say that about Saskatchewan. But the flip side of that is that it has a low chilling requirement, meaning that it doesn't stay dormant during moderate climate winters, such as the one that we have here in the Fraser Valley. And it's both extremely early and it's extremely early in that it crops early, so we could avoid extreme weather events in the summer, but it may also bloom when it's too cool for pollinators to be active. Just a little switching topics here, getting into the genetics and background. The Latin name is Lonicera cerulea. And depending on the taxonomist, it's either a bunch of different species or bunch of different subspecies. I tend to believe that there are different subspecies of Lonicera cerulea. The main ones coming from Russia are Edulis and Kamchatka. The Japanese subspecies is Amphilocalyx. There's an uncharacterized subspecies from the Kuril Islands. And then there's a subspecies called Velosa over most of Canada, though this hasn't been used in development of a commercial cultivar to date, to my knowledge. It's alternatively called Haskap honeyberry or blue honeysuckle. I prefer the name blue honeysuckle because that's a more representative name of all the different germplasm that is used in crop development. Haskap is a name that came from the Japanese type and has subsequently become the most popular name in North America as a marketing tool. So the crop is relatively recently domesticated. Plant breeding takes decades and centuries, and this crop just hasn't had as much time to be developed as something like a grape or an apple or a tomato. Further, some of the early work done on breeding this crop was done via open pollination, which does not lend itself to rapid genetic progress. The more recent advances have been taking place through using intentional crossing, such as the program at the University of Saskatchewan. As a relatively undeveloped crop, there's quite a range in performance across climatic regions for pretty much all the cultivars that are out there. And some of these are significant barriers to having an economically viable production system. I mentioned that it's an easy plant to grow. It's not so easy to harvest. Harvesting by hand, from personal experience, can take many hours longer to harvest 100 pounds compared to harvesting a blueberry, where you can harvest 100 pounds in, say, 2 or 3 hours. Haskap, it would take all day to harvest that amount. At the same time, because it's a relatively unknown crop, there's an unrealized potential in the market because it has not been made that leap to a mass market crop that everybody knows about. So we got a few publications on the phenology of the crop. And I just want to point out a few important points regarding its and as it relates to climatic adaptation. It breaks bud very early because that is a low chilling requirement. So the plant doesn't tend to stay dormant during the winter. It'll start breaking bud in early January for some types. And then that results in bloom that can sometimes be too early for pollinators to be available to pollinate the crop. However, because of that early crop and because it has a very early beginning to its development in the season, and because of a relatively short amount of time required to go from flowers to fruit, we have this early season crop that we could harvest around the same time as strawberries and before the extreme summer heat hits. Just a couple of pictures of some of the structures of the plant. You can see these spike-like buds on the side of the stem. Those are compound buds that have both vegetative and reproductive structures. As a new shoot emerges from that bud, it will have 1 or 2 or 3 nodes with little twin flowers hanging from them. And of course, the flowers result in the fruit. And you have fruit that are then harvested off of hanging from the base of the current season's growth. This is a graph in one of our publications showing the range of phenology for the crop. So we got Japanese curl and Russian germplasm groups, and then hybrids between the Japanese, Russian, and curl types compared against blueberries, raspberries, and strawberries. So this is comparing the rate of phenological development of the crop compared to these other mainstream crops. Green is bud break. You see bud break occurs quite early in as early as early February for or into January for some of the Russian material. Yellow is bloom because the flowers are yellow, so I coated them that color. And you can see that bloom is more than a month ahead of blueberry bloom. And already we have issues with low pollinator activity during blueberry bloom. And then blue and purple are fruit ripening and harvest date respectively. As you can see that the crop is, it's all done. It's all done by the time strawberries even start coming on, and well before raspberries and blueberries. What we found over time is that the best type of Haskap germplasm for adaptation to relatively moderate climates is Japanese germplasm, which also happens to have the best fruit quality and fruit set traits. There's generally poor adaptation of Russian material because it's from such a northern climate. It doesn't do well in an area like the Fraser Valley. And then there's relatively poor fruit quality in the Kyrle genetics that come from the islands north of Japan. However, we found that from looking at the genetics of the crop, there are, you can make hybrids between these different types in order to maintain an early advantage, combine fruit quality traits, extend the pollination window, as well as expand the harvest season. Just a few comments about the morphology here. I'm going to speed up a bit here because I lost a couple minutes at the start. Is that the Haskap fruit itself is a compound accessory fruit, and that is two little fruit inside of a non-fruit tissue. So what you get is two little berries that are then enclosed in a copula of accessory tissue that goes around the outside of the fruit in a process called false synanthy. This weird anatomy, and it is really weird if you have ever looked at the fruit, results in a huge range in fruit shape and appearance. And this is due to different length of that sheath that goes around the outside of the berry, and different positioning of the fruit within that sheath. And here's from an old Russian publication, some of the types of fruit shapes that you can have for this crop. Largely relating to this odd morphology where it's got this sheath over top of two separate berries, we have some limitations to the agronomic potential of the crop. You can see in the picture on the right-hand side here, some fruit that harvest really well and are fine, and others that just turn to juice as soon as you pick them off the bush. And there's a lot of variability between cultivars, not just within the germplasm, but actually within the cultivars that are currently available to industry. And so a challenge going forward to develop this as a mainstream crop is going to be getting it to the point where it will be machine harvestable for fresh markets or even for processed markets. Just a couple of details on the biochemistry. So it's got a decent range of sugar content from 8.5 to 2.9%. It's not particularly low in sugar, but it is relatively high in acid, higher than a raspberry. And so it's typically thought of as a relatively tart crop. However, the most important thing is really the ratio between the sugars and the acid. And that's really what informs your mouth of the aromatic profile of the berry. What we've seen and shown is that the ratio between sugar and acid, the TSS to TA ratio, is quite low for a whole range of this crop in comparison to blueberry and strawberry for sure, but actually does overlap with raspberry. And that the most important way that we can go about improving this crop's flavor profile, increasing its sugar to acid ratio, is going to be through decreasing the acid content as opposed to decreasing the sugar or increasing the sugar content. So you have to don't have to increase sugar, you just have to decrease the acid to make it a more palatable fruit. Final topic here before I open up for questions. The next steps in developing this crop is going to, in order to make it a way to sidestep climate change impacts, is through finding phenological variation that works in the target region. At the same time, there's got to be fruit morphological and biochemical traits that make it viable as a crop at the same time as growing properly in the environment. And so those three objectives are to expand its temperate climate phenological adaptation, increase its commercial agronomic potential, and then improve biochemical aspects of its fruit quality. And it remains my opinion, as it was in my thesis work, that this crop does have the legs that are required in order to make it into a mainstream crop, but it's going to take some work. It's going to take breeding, it's going to take applied research, and it's going to take effort from industry to develop its own production practices and a market for the product. With that, I'll take any questions.
Fantastic. Thank you, Eric. We do have some questions coming in. Luckily, you started answering people's questions during your presentation, so a couple of them have already shifted over. So we do have a question about the ripening of the Haskap or the blue honeysuckle. Do they ripen on the plant, and then what is the yield like?
Sure. So they do ripen on the plant, and they're actually a synchronous harvest. Raspberries you harvest 11, 13 times by machine. Haskap, you can go in one and done. It's actually a big advantage of the crop. And then, sorry, what was the second part of the question? Was
the yields. What are kind of
Yes.
the average yields that you would expect?
The age-old question. Yeah, that's something that we really haven't got established yet. There are some types of Haskap that are low yielding, only a couple of pounds per plant. And if you're planting at 1,500 plants per acre, it could be 3,000 to 4,000 pounds. There are lots of claims that you're going to be able to hit 8 or 10 pounds per plant. I have yet to see that on a commercial scale. The type of Haskaps that I'm currently working on developing, working primarily with Japanese genetics, I've seen up to 5 and 6 pounds per plant, which could translate to 10, 12,000 pounds per acre.
Yeah, it's good to know. And I would expect it would vary quite significantly depending. It looks like the genetics are very intricate. Like there's a lot going on and diversity you would see. And we do have a couple of questions around pollinators. So like, what are the best pollinators that are like best suited pollinators for Haskaps? And do they benefit from the buzz pollination like blueberries?
So I haven't seen any work on the relative efficacy of bumblebees on Haskap in particular. Bumblebees are typically more efficacious than honeybees across a range of crops. I don't think any specific research has been done on the buzz pollination aspect of that. It's such an early blooming crop that wild pollinators are going to be beneficial. But if you have a large field of 10, 20 acres of this crop, then European honeybees are going to be the only way that you can provide the quantity of pollination services that are required to set a proper crop. What's made more complicated with this crop is that it's got something called self-incompatibility, where the pollen of one clone or cultivar can't actually pollinate that same crop. It blocks the fertilization of the ovules. And so you have to have multiple varieties of Haskap interplanted in order to get effective pollination.
Yeah, I'm happy you pointed that out. I think so Haskaps have actually been identified by the University of Northern BC as a potential crop for diversification up here. And that was one thing that we learned a lot from Saskatchewan, the University of Saskatchewan, and clearly your work is really leading the information we have on those parts. And that is a question that we have here from Jesse McDonald, is what are our thoughts about, like, because we're looking at coastal BC, but what is the opportunity for this crop for the interior of BC, northern BC, that sort of a thing?
Yeah, most of the plantings in BC are in cooler climates than where I live here down in Chilliwack in the Fraser Valley. And that's partly due to land cost and opportunity cost of what other people are doing here versus interior climates. In general, it is better adapted to colder climates. And so I still do recommend people look closely at the Japanese cultivars that have come out of the program down in Oregon. Maxine Thompson, a private breeder, released several Japanese cultivars that I think have better fruit quality. But even those Japanese genetics that are better adapted phenologically to a place like the Fraser Valley, they're also going to be able to produce in a lot of the cooler climates of BC.
Yeah, and that was a specific question we had around if you would be so bold to start actually, is there specific types or specific cultivars that you would recommend? This one is specifically for the Okanagan.
Right. Okay. So for the Okanagan, so the University of Saskatchewan has some older cultivars that are not, my former supervisor, Bob Boers, is no longer recommending because newer and better things have emerged. So cultivars like Tundra, Indigo Gem, Indigo Yum, Borealis, these are no longer being recommended. And I would agree with that. There are some newer types that came out of that program that I don't have as much information on because they were released after I began my work, but some of those are Boreal Beast and Boreal Beauty and and Aurora. Those are hybrids between Russian and Kyril and Japanese, various types of hybrids. Don't remember the pedigree on each of them, but and then the pure Japanese material that came out of the University of, out of Maxine Thompson's breeding program include cultivars like Keiko, Tana, and Taka, and all of those I've got them here on my farm, and they've got excellent quality.
Okay. Oh yeah, that's good to know. I hadn't picked up on that from the work that we had done a few years ago. So it's exciting to see how much is changing so quickly in this field. And kind of related to the choosing the variety, we had a question here about, is it your kind of on the same lines, because of the early ripening, the low heat requirement? Is it your anticipation that the Haskaps will replace the less heat tolerant crops, or is it more likely to be used as a new crop in cooler areas?
Probably the latter. I think it's primarily going to be something that is used in cooler climates where other crops are not adapted. But there's the opportunity to diversify in a climate like the Fraser Valley, where we've already got 30,000 acres of blueberries. I don't think those 30,000 acres are going anywhere. And I don't think that this is going to replace those. It's just a way to diversify and to have additional income streams. I spoke about phenotypic plasticity. If you look at a blueberry, blueberries are being grown in Mexico and in Florida and in BC. So there's a huge range across different crop types, because there's high bush, there's southern high bush and northern high bush and rabbit eye blueberries, all different types that allow for us to adapt to changes in climate by planting different types of that crop. But Haskap would just be another type of crop entirely.
Right. Yeah, thank you. And hopefully the questions are just flooding in, and I'm having a hard time keeping up, but we'll see how many more we can answer. Maybe we'll be okay to go a few minutes over, since I took up some of your time earlier. So we do have a couple of questions around pests. So there's two on the top. Any comments on fruit rot or SWD susceptibility relative to blueberries?
That's another one where I think we're escaping a pest stress or avoiding it. It's such an early crop that it's not, that SWD, or spotted wing Drosophila, for those who don't have background in entomology, it can be infected by SWD. There's actually a publication from 2015 showing it as a native host, and I have found SWD in Haskap before, but it's so early that the populations are quite low, so it's not going to be a huge threat. Fruit rot, I grow my plants. I got about a 1/4 acre of research trials here, and I've never sprayed fungicides on them. Occasionally you'll get a little bit of botrytis fruit rot. I've seen anthracnose in the past, perhaps some alternaria, though I'm no pathologist, so I can't confirm. It can develop fruit rot, and it does ripen during a time that is typically quite rainy around here. But it may not require as close management as a crop like blueberry. And I think that the reason for that is that it takes time for production issues to develop in an area. You have to have a concentration of a crop for an extended period of time before pests and pathogens evolve pathogenicity and infectivity of a crop. And so issues are not as great now as for other crops, but they will become issues if it becomes a larger scale crop.
Perfect. And yeah, it looks like we're getting back to some questions around the Japanese varieties. There was a question of, are we able to get those Japanese varieties in BC? And if so, who would provide them?
Sure, they are available. I believe Sadhu and Sons growers carries some of the Japanese Haskap varieties. But there's others. There's Agri-Forest Biotechnologies up in the Okanagan. Yeah, there's a few.
Perfect. Trying to see, and I know we are at just after 10. maybe there's a couple more questions here, but maybe we'll wrap it up if that's okay. There's a lot coming in and I'm having a hard time keeping up with them. So we'll keep the link live. Luckily, all this will be captured moving forward. But first, I want to say thank you, Eric, for sharing this information and bringing all your past research to benefit us here in BC.
Happy to share my Egyptian spoons with you all.
And surviving some Saskatchewan winters.
I can't see anybody's faces, so I don't know if this joke has fallen flat, but
I don't think so. I think you're good. Perfect. So yeah, I do know that we have not had a chance to answer everybody's questions today. So I do encourage you to log into our work. We have a workshop discussion board on Padlet, and Shauna has shared the link in the chat box with us. And it's also available through the Eventbrite event page and workshop program. So you can continue the conversation with the presenters and ask your questions using that format and with others who have joined the webinar today. Feel free to share these links to your own projects or resources that are related to the topic and exchange further questions or comments. I did see that we had some discussion in resources already being shared, so that's great. Let's make sure that we continue that on with the discussion in Padlet. We will also follow up after the workshop with the session recording and a roll-up of all the resources that we've been mentioning throughout the workshop. So yeah, thanks again to our presenters and to everybody for joining in today. Behind the scenes, we would like to thank the Workshop Planning Committee, UBC IT, and the workshop funders, the BC Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Fisheries, and all of our other donors that make this work possible. Please join us for the rest of today's sessions. We're going to take a break, but come back at 11 o'clock for a 1-hour webinar on resources for managing berries and disease in berry production. At 1 p.m., we will also have a keynote with Dr. Hannah Burek from the North Carolina State University on the spotted wing Drosophila management. I am not an entomologist, so thank you for putting up with my pronunciations there. And at 3:30 p.m., the SWD discussion continues with a panel, which includes Vaughn Walton of the Oregon State University, Paul Abram and Chandra Moffat from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, and Jen McFarland from ES Crop Consult. You can find out all the details for those sessions underway in the Eventbrite page or the workshop program as well. And finally, thank you. Please let us know what you think about this webinar. You'll be directed to a really quick 2-question survey as soon as the session ends, and we really do appreciate all of your feedback. So thank you, and I'll see you guys hopefully all at the next session in just under an hour here.